Hey everyone, it's LS, and this is the patch 7.10 tier list that is going to help you too become legendary. Okay, so as always, before we dive into all of the champions and the tiers and everything, there's some few things I want to go over. The first is that this tier list is made with the assumption that you're going to commit at least 10 to 15 games with the champion, especially if you've never played them before, and that you're also going to follow the correct builds and research the players that play some of these champions at an extremely high level if they're a one trick and if the champion is not commonly seen inside of the solo queue ladder. I'll be getting into that later, but I just wanted to cover that first and foremost. Secondly, it's also important to note that if you don't see a champion here, that's either because I think it's too unique or it's too difficult to accurately place on the tier list. Another thing is that it could just not fit into the tier list, and I don't think that it warrants really even being placed on the list in general. And what I mean by that is that either it doesn't offer enough, or that it's not good enough at this point in time in the meta. Also, as a reminder, please take note that Diamond 250 LP and above will share a tier list with Master. So just remember to keep that in mind when looking at the tier list if you're a high diamond player and wondering why are some of these champions appearing on the list. One last thing before we dive into everything else. Just remember that the lower MMR tier list looks the way that it does because it's intentionally made to reduce the chance of making mistakes for yourself, and thus it's not as difficult for you to capitalize on opponents' mistakes. A lot of champions and how they act in laning phase are intentionally in here because they induce tilt and they're really difficult to deal with during the laning phase, something that should have a ton of emphasis at lower MMR. Alright, let's move straight into something that you're probably looking at across some of the lower MMR tiers. Yet again, Annie makes her triumphant return, and really I almost wanted to place her in a tier of her own at basically every MMR leading up to Diamond. I can't really stress enough that in her own right, she's basically a tier above almost everything else in this list. If I could have placed her God tier, I would have, but I think that it would have obstructed the way that the tier list looks, and I think that it would have just made it look a little bit funky, and I didn't want to do that. But first and foremost, Annie, mid-top, she is the go-to pick if you really would just want to get MMR really quick. Another thing moving forward is you'll notice that the 80 carries for the most part haven't really changed at all. We're keeping it super simple with Misfortune and Ashe across the board so that you don't have to worry about anything other than basic 80 carry mechanics and then basic macro play. There's no reason to make things more complex for yourself by playing Kog'Maw, Ezreal, Kalista, Xayah, or any of the other difficult 80 carry champions that become a lot more viable the higher that you move up in the ladder. Additionally, some people are probably wondering, well, if simple 80 carry mechanics are the issue, then why isn't Caitlyn here? Caitlyn is a champion that excels at being able to use her range to your advantage and understanding how to skew the lane in your favor. That's something that I think is just a little bit of a step above what you need to worry about with MF and Ashe. Moving into another champion that a lot of people might still be surprised to see appearing in the top lane is Darius. When you're going to be playing Darius, it's important to note that you're not running him with teleport at any of these tiers where he's appearing. You're going to be running him Ghost, and you're going to be playing him basically as a lane bully. He excels at low MMR where people don't understand lane management, and they don't know how to keep track of his passive. He itemizes extremely well, and he has the potential to go off. Because teleport is not really used properly at lower MMRs, he's able to get away with using Ghost and just the way that his passive and his kit works to really take control of the game and snowball completely out of control. Following up from Darius, we have another lane bully that remains a constant inside of my tier lists, and a lot of people probably raise their eyebrows when they see it, but it's Heimerdinger. Some people might have remembered that he just recently got a slight rework, but I think that the rework plays even further into how obnoxious he is as a laner and what it means for low MMR players to try to deal with him. The whole reason that he's here inside of the tier list and that he shows his head basically across the board in mid and top lane is primarily because he is the king of inducing tilt. He's really frustrating to play against, he's really obnoxious, he has the ability to play around his turrets, his ultimate gives him enormous 1v2 potential, and he asserts a lot of pressure that can make a laner just start to flame their jungler. And if you're not making your laner flame his jungler, then you're doing something wrong. Next up, a champion that is going to be popping back up again, and I wouldn't have included him in tier lists if I had done this a few patches ago, but Vladimir is back with some of the changes that Vladimir got and also the changes to just the meta in general. Especially at low and mid MMR, he's really great at sustaining the lane and providing a very safe and bully type lane phase. Vladimir also in top lane is exceptionally good against the tank meta right now, and he basically gets a free laning phase while being able to accelerate ahead of the opponent, and it makes it really easy for you to find yourself with either getting solo kills or creating giant CS leads for yourself. In mid lane, with players not really knowing how to play around Vladimir and the fact that he has a get out of jail free card inside of his W due to the proximity to his turret, it makes it really good and really safe. Two other champions that I want to talk about really quickly are the AD and AP mega bullies of top and mid lane. That's going to be Swain and Pantheon. If you haven't ever played Pantheon or Swain before, it's a nightmare to go up against them in lane because of how obnoxious they are. It's really difficult to lose laning phase as either one if you've put even a little bit of time into the champions, and because they're so oppressive, again at lower MMR, it induces tilt from your opponents. And because lower MMR players are less likely to have emotional control to not just tilt into their opponents or get frustrated with their teammates or feeling like they're losing so they have to have this carry mentality, it plays right into your hands and lets you get a very big carry going. Factor in the fact that Pantheon also has a global and how much people don't respect this in solo queue, he becomes a pretty big monster that can get out of control really quickly. If you are playing lane Pantheon though, make sure that you don't take his ultimate until level 7, 8, or 9, and just keep putting the points into Q and E for that super lane dominance. Also, don't take teleport on Pantheon. Another obscure champion pick that is returning to this tier list is yet again Mordekaiser. This is a champion that in solo queue a lot of people are overlooking. He has a really brutal laning phase that he can get away with as long as he doesn't get ganked, but even in some gank scenarios, because of his W, he's able to turn situations around quite handily on his own. Combine this with the fact that he has a lot of good matchups in top lane and even mid lane, it enables him to get out of control really fast, and people don't respect his ultimate and the fact that he can get dragon and do a lot with it later on. If you put a little bit of time into him, you're going to find yourself having a lot of success because of how frustrating it is for people to play against him, but also because of how uncomfortable it is to play against him because people aren't used to dealing with his passive shield. Make sure that you look up Phase Killer or Iron Revenant on the Korean server if you want to see more Mordekaiser play, because they're both challenger tier level Koreans that play Mordekaiser in top, mid, jungle, and AD carry. Alright, now we're going to start moving up the ladder a little bit and you'll start seeing some more familiar champions. Some people might be wondering about Ivern and why he's not appearing in lower MMR. The reason that you don't want to play Ivern at lower MMR is Ivern is the king of bad, but not the king of terra bad. So what ends up happening is if you play Ivern in super low MMR, all the advantages and the things that he's really great at doing, which is putting the enemy jungler behind and creating a lot of pressure early and giving your teammates a lot of dive potential and extended teamfight potential, doesn't really exist because of how chaotic lower MMR can be. But then in addition to that, the enemy junglers might not actually know the routes that they're doing, and it might not end up panning out the way that you want. I suggest starting to play Ivern from Platinum and up. That's when people start thinking a lot more, and Ivern becomes a lot more useful. Again, he's really good at punishing people for making mistakes, and he's also the king of playing off of an opponent's tilt. Another champion that, moving forward, is sort of low on the tier list, even in higher up Master and Challenger tier, is Kennen. Kennen's one of the more dominant top laners right now in the current meta, and he has been for a while, ever since the appearance of the on-hit Kennen build. The problem with that is the micro and the spacing that goes into making Kennen a monster, and then the understanding of letting him get to the point where no one can stop him in the split push, but also a team willing to not fight and let Kennen do what he wants to do and what he needs to do is going to be a little bit difficult to come by. And so for those exact reasons, I don't feel like the average person is going to balance Kennen's microaggression inside of the lane and get the type of leads and pressure that you would normally expect from a professional level player. Another familiar face now that is returning to the Rift and popping back up ever so slightly is Kassadin. Most people probably remember him from Season 3, Season 4, when he was a complete monster and then he got gutted into the ground. Well, Kassadin's kit is still his kit, and no, I'm not talking about LeBlanc's clit. His Rift Walk is really obnoxious, and it's a super powerful tool inside of solo queue. Kassadin is normally known for having rough laning phases, but the problem is that it takes actually a pretty decent amount of knowledge to know exactly what makes Kassadin have a rough laning phase, and then the ability to inflict the amount of pressure on him that makes his laning phase so rough. Because of that, he's normally able to get away and go basically unscathed in most laning phases and glide into that mid-game power spike that makes Kassadin so strong and he's able to get out of control. Another thing is that he benefits so well from running teleport, and that opens up a lot of options in the later stages of the game because he's not so reliant on just getting kills in lane or having any sort of a snowball occur. Kassadin wins by not losing, and that's something that can't be said about a lot of champions in the game. Now let's touch on jungle a little bit. Evelynn and Zac basically remain as a staple across the majority of the tiers, and that's because they're so good inside of solo queue. Zac gives you a ton of durability, ton of sustain, really high threat pressure, and he itemizes really well. Evelynn is obviously fantastic at abusing people's lack of respect for her existence in the game, but also that they don't really know how to play around her and play with control wards properly that would shut Evelynn down. Because of this, she's super strong, and it becomes really easy to snowball out of control in solo queue. Following that up, Graves and Elise are side by side with them, primarily because the farming style in the West is something that's very common, and that exactly plays into what Graves wants ideally in order to be effective. When you move down the jungler list a little bit, you still have good CC, good stable clear junglers that are also able to exert a lot of pressure early on. The reason that some of the junglers such as Lee Sin and Nunu are in the B tier in Challenger, for instance, is primarily because Nunu's not going to carry a game solely by himself. There's going to be a little bit more involved in a Nunu carrying the game unless it's through the jungler's own ability as a player. The other thing with Lee Sin is that Lee Sin is going to end up getting into a lot of situations where the champion is just not going to be as efficient as other junglers in the game if you and your teammates are incapable of seeing the situations that are in front of you and then capitalizing on them in order to make Lee Sin an effective and solid pick. For these reasons, I have Lee Sin listed lower than a lot of the other junglers in Challenger and obviously Master Tier as well, because it's a lot easier to execute and follow through with those champions than it is for Lee Sin, and there's less teamwork involved. So rounding this tier list out, one of the things that's probably still raising some eyebrows is the either absence of some of the champions in the higher MMRs or their placings on the list. Again, some of these champions I feel like only certain players are really going to be exceptional at in those specific tiers. One of the champions that I immediately think of when saying that is LeBlanc. I know that LeBlanc is an exceptional champion and she is one of the best in the game currently. I don't believe that a random challenger player could pick up LeBlanc in 10 to 15 games and then make LeBlanc perform at the level that she would be effective at that tier compared to other champions. When going through this type of logic and applying it to other roles and positions, that's also why you'll see some champions missing from this tier list. Most notably is going to be Ezreal, or why is Xayah so low on the tier list, or where is Twitch, who we know is a really good champion. Don't forget that this is a solo queue tier list and it's not for competitive, so of course it looks completely different. Anyways, concluding this tier list, I just want to say, like always, there will be a stream where I will do an AMA answering certain questions that people might have about the tier list, and you can find the time and date for that stream in the description below on YouTube, and then if you missed that, you can probably catch it in my Twitch TV past broadcasts. Hope you guys enjoyed the tier list, and I'll see you again in a few patches.